All right, well, welcome back. Again, History of Western Civilization, number 8, the 8th century. As always, be sure you watch the entire slide deck, check out the very last slide, pause the video, and look at the list of sources there. Those are for you. You can look up additional information using those, and of course, make sure that we're giving credit to all of these sources, especially for the images. I've mentioned in class, Wikimedia Commons is a great source for you when you're working on a project. That's where I get a lot of my stuff too. And Wikimedia, I'll just go ahead and take the time right now to say that's a good place, primarily because if there's any source information, the origin, if there's copyright, whether or not the items in the public domain, all of that information is clearly laid out. So you're not guessing based on, okay, is this stock photo from Britannica article my property now, or does it belong? Who does it belong to? You don't have to ask questions like that and get yourself into a pickle. So definitely take the time at the end of the slides to check out all the sources. So here we go. The 8th century, that would be 700 to 799. And we begin in Japan. So we've talked about religion being a source of struggle in Japan, and this is a new era for the Japanese. They sort of blend religion and government, and what's called the Taiho Code is written. This is sort of a blend of Chinese civil law, Chinese Confucianism, Japanese Taoism, a lot of things all rolled into one. And the emperor is a supreme moral authority. He is supposed to be a benevolent ruler, and the ministers and bureaucrats are his agents, and they're also supposed to be these moral authorities. But the emperor really is supposed to stand above all of this. And if the local lords are feuding, or if there's executions and sadness that have to arise as the result of government, that's happening below his level. So this is the beginning of the elevation of the emperor far above the rest of Japanese society. So along with this code, this moral code called the Taiho Code, there's also a civil administrative code written into this same set of laws. So while this legal code is not within our own lineage as far as our legal system is concerned, our common law system that we use in the United States, in the West, but it's still very important. It's the first set of laws written down that contains administrative laws and criminal laws in the same document. So that's very interesting. And the map is showing you the yellow is the portion of Japan that's actually under the control of the emperor, and the laws divided into 66 provinces. And that's going to stay for quite some time. So in China, Empress Wu is still reigning. She's proclaimed a new dynasty that's to be named after her. She's lowered taxes for certain groups of the society, such as farmers. But by 705, she's quite old and has basically lost control at the court. So she's forced to resign, and a member of the Tang family returns to power. There are no records of her death. She wasn't executed in a fashion that it made it into the public record, so presumably she was old enough they just sort of told her to disappear. So that's it, an inglorious end to her very interesting reign. Yep, she's expired by 707. She has died. Not really sure the circumstances there. So also in China, this is around 708, we start seeing records of tea becoming very popular. It's really safer to drink boiled water than raw water in China at this time. And the tea itself is believed to have medicinal properties. And so as you can imagine, this becomes very important social activity. By 710, the Japanese have made a little bit of an alteration, not so much in their government structure, but their government location. When the emperor dies under less than ideal circumstances, and that would include natural illness. If the emperor dies of anything other than peaceful old age, that's believed to bring a kind of pollution on the capital city, and so the capital has to be moved. So when the emperor dies in 710, the capital is moved from Osaka to the city of Nara, which now, so we're clear, that's not a long way. You can ride the bus or the metro to Nara from Osaka, and it's a day trip from Tokyo. Not a big deal to travel to this place. It's not a long distance. And in the picture, these are Sika deer, and they basically roam free all over the historic city. Tourists feed them. They live a pretty good life. So back to the west. In 711, a Muslim army crosses the Straits of Gibraltar and begins a conquest of Spain. And there are quite a few Jews that live in Spain at this time under Christian rule, and they're excited to see the Muslims coming. They think this is a signal of better times to come for them. Meanwhile, the central authority for the Arab civilizations is dealing with raids on their own property in the east. So these guys are conquering Spain, looking for a slightly safer place to live than North Africa and Asia Minor, where they're dealing with these incursions from Mesopotamia, from Persia, places like that. So this is actually the other side of the story in Spain. This is King Don Rodrigo, and he is arranging his troops before the battle at Guadalete. And this painting is from 1871 by Bernardo Blanco y Perez. I know we talked in class about, there's the hashtag, there's a feed on Twitter, it's famous leaders pointing out the Lou, and so here's Don Rodrigo. The Lou is that way. So Don Rodrigo was the leader of the Visigoths who lived in southern Spain when the Muslims invaded. So Don Rodrigo, obviously he's Spanish, so the Romans, who were Spanish, Latin language, etc., have blended with the Germanic Visigoths, where you definitely have a Germanic style of dress and weapons, but the names are Latin. They are Hispanic names. So by 717, the Arabs have dealt with their problems in the east and the west, and this is the extent of the Caliphate at this time. They have conquered Lisbon. They're into the Caucasus, including Armenia, which is north of Damascus, in this central area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And they start to become very wealthy. They collect taxes, and the Caliph Omar II actually exempts believers, exempts Muslims from the taxes. They're bringing in so much. And they're also obviously looting the wealthy during any conquests, things like that. So this is the Umayyad Caliphate, and they would be the second group to rule Islam after the death of Muhammad. We'll talk about this more than once here, but the line of succession, the way Islam is ruled, is very complicated, and lots of lines of who succeeded who and who was legitimate and who was not, and all that. But for our purposes here, the Umayyad Caliphate, it's 11 million square kilometers, which for the Americans in the room, that's about almost 4.5 million square miles, 33 million people, which puts it up in the top 10 largest empires in history, both in area and as a proportion of the world population. Okay, eventually they'll fall from power, and they really only maintain a hold on Spain, and the Iberian Peninsula is the name for Spain. Very, very interesting group of people. Back to the Roman Empire. Here's a sign of sadness for you. Constantinople is currently under the rule of Emperor Leo III, and just the red is the empire. Look at the state of this thing. What in the world? What has happened? So you basically have the empire, right? What would be modern Turkey in the far east. And then just these little bits, right? Anywhere there's a big enough city to maintain control, which really means an independent army, someone somewhere who is considering himself the equivalent of a vassal of the emperor is maintaining control. And that's it. That's all there is to it. Not a lot left. And here's the coin here. This is Leo, and not good. So, in 722, Leo forces the Jews in Constantinople to convert. And this appears to be successful. After 2 or 3, 4 years, in 726, Leo's not satisfied that the conversions were really genuine, were really effective. And so he's searching for ways to get the Jews on board and make it easier to gain Muslim converts as well. So he's trying to bring people back into the Christian fold, and he decides a big barrier for these groups is the making of religious images. So he issues a series of edicts against the veneration of images, and these are starting in 726 through 729. So this prohibition, if you recall, we talked about not picturing Muhammad, that he's not drawn, and often people are not drawn. Some think that he was almost exclusively influenced by Islam in a positive sense. He believed that they had the right idea about making images. Others say, no, this was a political expedient. Either way, the cross was maintained as a symbol of Christianity, but everything else is forbidden. No images of Christ or anyone else. And existing images, unfortunately, it's great sadness, were destroyed, often destroyed, sometimes hidden. So there are obviously lots and lots of pictures of iconoclasm. So the background that we sort of can't see is the emperor ordering destruction of religious items. And then you can see in the top right, there's a wooden image that the face of the image has been erased. And then at the bottom right, these have been scratched off. These have just been broken away. And then the mosaic looking mural in the middle is actually a picture of someone destroying a picture, which is, again, some of these interesting ironies. The vast majority of Christian theologians and the monks, who are, again, this sort of more spiritual, separated from the political operations of the church characters, they all oppose these. And in the western parts of the empire, the people themselves basically refuse to obey. 2 popes, Gregory II and Gregory III, argue against this. He said, no, the use of images is part of our religion. There's a right way to do it. They get into a fight with the emperor. They anathematize iconoclasm. They excommunicate the iconoclasts, which would include the emperor. And in 740, Leo retaliates by transferring southern Italy from the papal control, papal diocese, to the Patriarch of Constantinople. There are armed outbreaks in some of these places, and the emperor has to use a lot of time, resources, military might to subdue this issue he's got going on in the western part of the empire. In the end, he's not able to really button it up, to quell the unrest, and he loses control of, for example, Ravenna. The city of Ravenna becomes detached from the empire. They're independent, and everybody in Italy just kind of keeps doing whatever they want, and they're safely able to ignore him. So again, chipping away increasingly, the emperor is not able to control even the things that everybody agrees belong to him. Meanwhile, in England, in 731, an English historian and theologian named Bede writes what's called the Ecclesiastical History. He is the guy who decides to renumber the years based on them beginning at the time of the birth of Christ. So year numbering was scattered, inconsistent, all over the place, often used the reign of a king as a means of dating. in the 5th year of this person's reign, the 8th year of that person's reign, which obviously from place to place led to errors and variation in when exactly things happened. So he says, no, we're going to divide time into BC and AD, and that's going to be the end of it, and it sticks. Eventually that will become the standard for numbering years in all of the West. Bede is a saint. He's usually called Bede the Venerable or Venerable Bede, and he's considered the last of the early church fathers. So his histories are very important. They're the last things written before what we're going to start calling the Dark Ages begin. The West stops keeping good records, or those records are kept, but they're going to be lost. Muslim conquest, general decline in culture and cities, plagues, all kinds of things start happening. And so for several centuries, history, science, and medicine are really only going to be kept up by the great Muslim cultures in North Africa, the Middle East, and Spain, and anyone who stays in contact with them. The Rome itself, even Constantinople, is going to be increasingly cut off from everywhere else. Those are no longer the sources of great learning and great science. It's going to be literally dark for a couple centuries. I really like this painting. This is called The Last Chapter. It's by J. Doyle Penrose and was painted in 1902. So this shows Bede. He is translating and then dictating to be written down the Gospel of John from Latin into English. So he's the old guy, and this is the end of his life, basically. It's one of the last things he did. And then the scribe is obviously doing the writing. So what's happening elsewhere? In 732, the Muslims are raiding from Spain north across the Pyrenees Mountains into the territory of the Franks. So a Frankish knight, king, lord, guy named Charles Martel leads an army and defeats a large Muslim force, and he gets the name the Hammer. He becomes a very popular figure in literature. He's famous for the fearless battles he fought. The legends say he would surround the Muslims with his cavalry and he'd block them into a corner against a rock, against a river, against something they couldn't get away from, and smash them like he was the hammer and the rock was the anvil. And there you go. It's a very inspiring character. So this is obviously a painting. Charles Martel is on the right. And you can see it's a little anachronistic, but he's got the French fleur-de-lis, so he's a French king. He's Christian. This is an emblem usually for Mary. You see his crown, all this nice imagery that shows you who he is and what he's doing. So what's going on in Japan? This is 737, and this is a really terrifying picture, so I should probably explain it first. This is called the smallpox demon, and it's from a series of prints done by a Japanese artist named Yoshitoshi in the late 1800s. So this is a warrior in the foreground, and we can't see, he's got a weapon, and he's about to strike down, he's about to defeat this scary flying demon that brings smallpox. Because what's going on in Japan? They've had a smallpox epidemic. It's going for 2 years. And some estimates say as much as a third of the population of Japan is killed by this disease. So very creepy. Meanwhile, in China, the Tang Empire was doing great. There had been the son of and the grandson of Empress Wu are able to kind of bring back the Chinese economy. And then it's very sad, I guess. The emperor falls in love with his son's wife. So this would be the great-grandson of Empress Wu is married to a Taoist priestess, and his dad, the emperor, falls in love with her. It's bad. Everything falls apart. Bad times in China. It's a little complicated, I know, but that's okay. Now here's something, this is something different. So by 750, the Ummayyad Caliphate, which we've talked about, has run out of people who are willing to fight wars for them. And they end up being conquered, basically. They're overthrown by an army of mixed nationalities from all over the place, mainly places that we would today consider Iran and Persia. The last of the Umayyad caliphs, Marwan, is beheaded, and his relatives are murdered. But this is the front and back of a coin from Marwan's reign. So what do you notice here? In comparison to all the other coins they've looked at, there are no images of people, right? So that's a little different. Usually a coin has the picture of the ruler. And like, do you find it surprising? In this, Muslim coin, there are no people pictured. So anyway, so Marwan was the 14th of the Umayyad dynasty in just a little under 100 years of power. And the new group to come to power is led by Abu Abbas al-Sarraj. So they become the Abbasids, or the Abbasid Caliphate. And they show up, they begin their rule with kind of a show of piety. They talk about reform. They give prominent positions in the state government to Islamic theologians. And they at least pretend to, and some things they actually do, consult experts in Islamic law on how they're going to run their civil society. It's about this time Arabian mathematicians begin using numbers that came from India, and they stop using Roman numerals, right? Because Roman numerals are simple but cumbersome, right? A number can become very, very long. And the Indian method of using drawn characters, because 0 through 9 type system, and you have columns, right? The idea of place value in columns and using the same digits over and over is going to be and exciting and much simpler than what had been done with Roman numerals. Okay, now, this is not an old picture. This is a current picture. This is a modern picture of the Tallis River. So why do we care? So in 751, an Islamic army in Central Asia defeats the Chinese at what's called the Battle of Atlak, which is here on the banks of the Tallis River. And Muslims replace the Chinese as the dominant influence along what we call the Silk Road, the great trading routes. There's more than one. It's not just one Silk Road, from east to west and back. Now, not very exciting picture. Doesn't seem like a very appealing place. Why do we care about this battlefield, this place, this event? So I will tell you. So this is the event that puts paper making within the reach of the Western world. Okay, so Chinese prisoners of war at this battle bring the technology of making paper with them. And what is about to become an Islamic empire, again, right, a new caliphate, a new empire, has access to paper making. Eventually, they're going to transfer that same technology to Europeans. So, as the Muslim influence in the Middle East is growing, the Far East and the West will be cut off from each other, right? And even some parts of Europe are cut off from one another. But what's going on right now, these last days before, again, the Dark Ages, so-called Dark Ages, begin, these are all significant events. And the fact that paper making is going to be something that the Arabian empires, that the Islamic empires take up and get good at and make part of their culture is important. Otherwise, this would have been stuck in China for another 400 or 500 years, probably. Okay, yet another piece of art that I couldn't not include. So, in 751, the last Merovingian king of the Franks, Childeric III, is deposed by Pope Zachary. The Pope's like, you're terrible, you can't be king anymore. So, if you recall, the Merovingians are the sons and grandsons and great-grandsons of Clovis, the first king of France, back when nobody called it France and no one would know what you were talking about if you said you were French. So, a new dynasty is going to begin. the son of Charles Martel, Pepin the Short, is the beginning of that line. So we'll talk about him more in a moment. But for now, this painting is called The Last of the Merovingians, and it was done by Évariste Vital Luminet, probably in the 1700s. And so what's happening is his hair is being cut. Long hair is a symbol of power, and cutting the emperor's long, gorgeous hair was symbolic of his fall from authority. Very important moment, very meaningful, very vivid symbol. Everybody would have understood the emperor having his hair cut was a big moment. So, moving on, going back to the Arabs, to Arabia, to the Middle East, the Caliph Mansur moves the Abbasid capital to Baghdad in 763. Eventually, Baghdad is going to be built up into this really incredible, elaborate city. The Abbasids become extremely wealthy. They have an advanced culture, warriors, traders, scientists. Again, they're sitting on top of trade routes that nobody else has access to both ends of. Baghdad's going to be laid out like a circle. So you can see this map. There's the central building is a mosque, a grand mosque. There are palaces, all these little canals, right, to divide up the city. The blue lines are canals coming off the Tigris River. Very, very fancy. A city that basically becomes legendary. It's everything that everybody says that it is. Gold and fancy buildings and beautiful gardens and all these other things. So, but they've got a little bit of trouble on their border in Persia. In 767, Muqana leads thousands of troops against the Abbasids, robbing caravans, destroying mosques. He claims that he's a prophet, and his name means veiled one. So when he was a young man, he had an accident which caused burns on his face. So he always wore some kind of mask or veil to hide it. And this is a pretty famous image. There's lots of different versions of this, but basically he lifts up his mask, and his face is so terrible, it causes horror in all that see it. So this girl's hiding her face from his scary scars, whatever those are. So this forces the Abbasids, the Arabian Empire based in Baghdad, to fight a war and deal with this guy on their border. This is a really weird connection. I do not know why, but a group, kind of like the Elks, like a Moose Lodge, started up in the early 1900s, and they called themselves the Order of the Veiled Prophet. And they were in St. Louis, Missouri. They had meetings, they had secret handshakes, they would hold a parade, all these kinds of things. And they had an annual Veiled Prophet parade every year in St. Louis, and it was not renamed to something other than the Veiled Prophet Parade until 1992, when it just was called the St. Louis Parade. But anyway, it's just an odd thing. There are many odd things. Everything is odd. So, 768, I mentioned Pepin the Third, or Pepin the Short, who took over after Childeric got his haircut. So he's been king for about 6 or 7 years, and then he died. His oldest son, Charles, inherits half of the Frankish Empire. So this is Pepin's son, Charles. His grandfather was Charles Martel, the great foe of the Moors. Okay, so this Charles, who's receiving his crown right now, is going to rule half the Frankish Empire until somebody else dies, then he's going to get the whole thing. Somebody that we should get to know. Hint, hint, hint. But first, a brief stop in Japan. Yeah, don't mind the gravestone. Spoiler alert. Just don't pay attention. So, going back to Japan just briefly. So, the Fujiwara family is a powerful noble family, and they remove the current ruler of Japan, who's a woman, Empress Shotoku, They say, nope, you can't be empress anymore. She had fallen in love with a Buddhist monk. She had promoted him as chief minister. There's intrigue. There's nepotism. It's not good. And the high society in the capital city was just shocked. No, that's not going to work. And so she's deposed. She's removed from power. And women are not going to be allowed to hold the imperial seat again. So she messed it up for everybody. Okay, so back to Charles, king of all his father's empires. So this Charles, a devout guy, he occasionally will hurry down to Italy on horseback and give the Pope a hand if he needs an army. So in this painting, you see King Charles on the left, on the horse. He's talking to the Pope. Yep, sure, Pope, I can do whatever you need. No problem. Got a very positive relationship with Rome. Confusingly for us, as it was typical for royalty of the day, though, he also has 4 wives and children by at least 5 mistresses. So you're like, okay, well, what does devout mean? In 772, he starts a 30-year war of conquest, and he's going to basically rebuild the empire of the Franks with it reunited. It had been split by the Merovingians. It was in bad shape. He's going to put it all back together. So around the same time, people start calling him Charles the Great, which, how would we say in France? So here he is. So Charlemagne overruns the Lombards, who are French. They're living in northern Italy and the center part of modern France. He divides the Lombard territory with the Pope, and he gives the Pope the part that would be Italy, and he keeps the part that would be France. And this is actually the creation of the Papal States. So the first time there's land carved out on the Italian peninsula that some secular ruler who's the neighbor says, hey, that's yours, Pope, you rule it. This is 774. So almost 1,000 years, a little more than 1,000 years before the United States, right? So he gives the Pope northern Italy, and you can see he's got bishops that travel with him and his army. So this painting is called Charlemagne and the Army, and it was painted by Ari Schaefer in 1840, not 1480, painted in 1840. So you see again the priests, the bishops, the soldiers, the people. Kind of looks like he's blessing them. I think he's telling the priest to bless them. The priest also has his hand out. So there you go. 1775. I'm having trouble with dates today. In 775, Charlemagne begins a war in the north as well. So he is fighting the Saxons, who are German, and he kills them and or forces them to convert to Christianity, one of the two. So the yellow down here, where it says Bologna in the middle, that's the Lombardy that he gave to the Pope. So it's the Papal States. And Saxony is where he's fighting currently. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople, so we had Leo III, now we've had Leo IV, and even Leo IV has died. So now we are going to enter a very interesting, strange, complicated little bit of Byzantine history. So Emperor Leo IV has died, and his wife Irene becomes regent. His son Constantine is only 10 years old, and there are brothers, the brothers of the emperor, in the mix. So Irene decides to use her power to the utmost. She has the brothers whipped and then shaves their heads, and we all know what that means now. Their heads are shaved and they're banished. So Leo is dead, his brothers are banished, and the son, Constantine, is going to take a back seat to Irene. So this is a coin from Irene's reign. She's on the left, and then on the right is Constantine, who again is a child right now, but he's shown there next to her. But this is the front or the obverse of the coin, and they're shown as co-rulers. Okay, they're the same size. he ought to be bigger because she's the regent. Okay, but he's not. Also, it's kind of hard to tell, but Irene, again, who's on the left, is holding the orb, which is the symbol of power, right? Not Constantine. And only Irene's name is on this side of the coin, on the front of the coin. Constantine's name is on the back, which shows that he's less important. So already, just in this one little image, you've got a lot of information about how she's asserting herself as the leader of the empire. And of course, she knows she needs friends. As early as 781, she starts trying to develop a relationship with the Carolingians, with Charlemagne, and with the Pope in Rome. She arranges a marriage between Constantine and one of Charlemagne's daughters. That falls through. And she does start to try and develop a relationship with the Pope, which she does by convening an ecumenical council. And if you recall, in the East, and in the West for a long time, in the East, it's the emperor who calls the council, and the emperor actually sits at the head of the council. You remember seeing Constantine sitting in the council room, and the documents that the council fathers decide on are brought to the emperor to be signed. So here you have, obviously, right in the middle, Irene. Okay, so she's sitting next to Constantine, who's, again, smaller, less important, younger. He is holding a staff of authority. And they're each holding an icon of Mary or Jesus. So she calls this council to refute the iconoclasm of Leo III. All right. Among the people, among the priests and monks, they're still keeping relics and images and worshiping. But she puts an end to the punishment for that. And she has this council that's going to rebuild the relationship between Constantinople and the Pope. And the Pope is happy, like, oh, good job. We're very happy about that. This is also a way for her to try and separate Charlemagne from the Pope a little bit. She considers herself to be in competition with Charlemagne. She's afraid of someone rising in the West and taking part of the old empire. In general, the leadership of the Eastern Empire are not happy to see what's happening with Charlemagne. Just wait, right? Just wait till they see what happens in a couple years. But there's not really any evidence that Charlemagne wanted the Eastern Empire. So this is not a mutual, this is not like a burgeoning war or anything like that. It's just something that Irene is working to solidify her own position of influence before Charlemagne gets all of it. So I hope we can appreciate the irony of using an icon to discuss icons. I mentioned Irene and Constantine in the middle. The priests, the Byzantine priests, are the ones with the white and the crosses. And the little hobbit guys down at the bottom right are the Pope's representatives. So those are the Western priests and monks who have come to represent the Pope. So, moving a little bit more quickly, there's a lot in this century. Charlemagne learns to read, and he orders all of the priests and monks to learn to read. And they need to be able to read and speak in Latin, right? No more of this local language stuff. It's not civilized. And what he wants is there to be a consistent system of education, that every monastery and every cathedral have a school where the clergy and whatever layman appropriate can learn to read, so that there's consistent means of communication throughout his growing empire here. So this is the beginning of what we'll start calling the Carolingian Renaissance. In India, new philosopher named Shankara develops a philosophical system that basically says every soul is God, every soul is divine, is a divinity, is a divine being. So this is a painting of that from 1904. So this is a painting from 1904 by Raja Ravi Varma, and it's just called Adi Shankara and his disciples. So, not going to explain this whole slide, just the important bit. A Shia Islam kingdom is established in Morocco. They declare their independence of the Caliphate in Baghdad. And this is just another chapter in this very, very complicated branching of Islam, all of which revolves around some kind of question of succession of authority. This chart just, again, this is just illustrative. This is only the Shia branch of Islam, okay? This Moroccan kingdom that has started will eventually become, their sect will be called the Zaidi, over here on the left. There are still actually Zaidi Muslims today, mostly in Yemen. And it has to do with whether or not they accepted some of the early caliphs before Muhammad's son-in-law Ali becomes a candidate for leadership. Very, very complicated, not a lot of agreement. But you can just see you're going to get, it's going to get more complicated before it gets less complicated. Most of them, their names come from someone. We sort of ignored Tibet. We skipped over this Tibetan Empire, but it's been there. It's between China, Mongolia, and Persia, and India all along. They kind of have kept to themselves, so we haven't talked about them a lot. But the map on the left shows the greatest extent of the Tibetan Empire, and that happens about the time we're talking about now. We're in the late 700s, around 790. And the picture on the right is one of the largest and earliest Buddhist monasteries built in Tibet called Samye. And Buddhism is pretty much the primary and only religion in Tibet from the time it arrives. There's not this long conflict with the local religion like has happened in China and Korea and Japan. They accept it pretty quickly and it becomes their only religion. And these are anybody who comes from Norway to Scotland. In 793, Scandinavians reached the island of Lindisfarne, Scotland, kill the monks, and loot the monastery. This is the first recorded raid by the people that we're going to start calling the Vikings. We know it's not the first raid, but this is the first one where there's a solid record of exactly when they came, exactly what they did, exactly where they came from. So Lindisfarne is also known as Holy Island. It's off the coast of Northumbria, or Northumberland, which is the extreme north area of modern England and then part of southern Scotland. So the monastery there, it's 150 years old, and it had been built by one of those kings that we talked about last century, King Oswald of Northumbria, and it becomes sort of a base for Christianity. It attracts monks from all over the place, including from Ireland. And they created some pretty interesting things. Like, there are obviously millions and millions of pieces of art about the Vikings. I chose this thing on the bottom right. This is the first page of the Gospel of St. Matthew from an illuminated manuscript called the Lindisfarne Gospel. So those were done there by the monks at Lindisfarne. And then the top right is, we're not sure if it's part of a gravestone, a grave marker, a memorial, or if it's just artwork showing people coming with weapons and attacking the monastery. It's called the Lindisfarne Stone. So the assault shockwaves across the whole Christian world. Everybody hears about this. There's a scholar at Charlemagne's court named Alcuin of York, and he calls Lindisfarne the most venerable site in all of Britain. And in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he writes, "Heathen men made lamentable havoc in the Church of God in Holy Island." And then the other image here, obviously, there's a map. People coming from Norway to Scotland, and shenanigans begin. In 794, the Japanese moved their capital again due to the death of the emperor. He dies of an illness. Bad omen. Need to give the spirit of the dead peace by moving the capital away from where he died. So they moved to a place that's going to be eventually called Kyoto. This is important because that's the capital of Japan for over 1,000 years. It's like going forward all the way into the 1800s, which is a very long time considering how often they've been moving it up to this point. Back to Empress Irene. She is now in her late 40s, and her son is in his late 20s. And they've been competing for power, and Irene wins. He tries a couple times to build some kind of coalition, get out from under her foot, and she's able to stop him every time. And then eventually, she has her son blinded and sent into exile, which is awful. It's just like, she did what to her own son? I'm not sure this makes it better or worse, but blinding and other types of mutilation, such as cutting off someone's hands or nose or tongue, were very common means of political punishment. So either for having done something you ought not to have done, or if you were a rival to the person in power, it was a way to ensure that you were not able to take or regain your power. So he dies. She banishes him, but he doesn't survive very long after having his eyes gouged out. Presume they were not doing this with surgical precision. And that brings us to the end of the 700s. So all my people who were assigned the 9th century, the 800s, they know what's coming, right? What's going to happen? We'll leave that for next time. Make sure you look at the sources on the next page, and we will see you again.